Let's talk more about the state of the governing party with political analyst, Professor Stephen Friedman. Professor, good evening. Great to speak to you. A lot that's been transpiring in the ANC. One of those things is acknowledgement that, according to Fikile Mbalula, the ANC MPs may have been forced to lie about that fire pool in Nkandla and many, many other issues. So, your thoughts on where the ANC is at the moment ahead of this watershed election a few months away?
Yeah, good evening, Hugo. Look, I mean, the first point I think to make about the ANC is that it seems to be generally assumed now that the ANC is going to drop below 50% at the next election. And although that is certainly a real possibility, and it's suggested by by-election results, I think it would be a mistake to assume that it's inevitable. It's quite possible to imagine a situation in which the ANC does scrape home. But of course, even if it does that, I mean, we can be pretty sure that it will lose ground at the next election, that it will almost certainly lose Gauteng and will probably lose KwaZulu-Natal. So it is a party in decline. Whether it can stop that decline is, of course, the question it's going to have to answer over the next few months. My own sense is that once a governing party is in decline, it's very difficult to stop the decline, and that about all you can do as the governing party is to make it slower. So making it slower would mean surviving above 50% just at the next election, but going below it at the one afterwards. So we are looking at a governing party in decline, which is pretty much standard in those countries which have had long-serving governments of the sort after decolonization, after the end of apartheid in our case, that they do run out of steam. And I think the ANC is gradually, or not so gradually, in the process of going through that.
Well, we've just listened to Cyril Ramaphosa, the ANC president, tell us that 30 years isn't enough time for his party to correct the injustices of the past. Is this a fair statement, or is it almost an admittance to the ANC's failures of the last 30 years?
Well, 30 years is obviously not enough. The question which the ANC has to answer to its voters is whether it's done enough over that 30 years. I think it would be very unreasonable to accuse any governing party, I mean, given the effect on our country of apartheid, it would be very unrealistic to expect any governing party to have got rid of the effects of apartheid in 30 years. On the other hand, very legitimate questions can be asked about what the ANC has been doing to get rid of those effects. I mean, obviously it's done some things, but I think many people who are part of the majority in this country would feel that it hasn't done nearly enough. So, the idea that the only problem is that we just haven't had enough time is not valid. The question I think voters will be asking themselves is whether the governing party has done enough in those 30 years to justify its view that it should be given another 5 years to carry on doing what it's been doing up to now.
Now, a thorn in the flesh of the ANC at this present moment is Jacob Zuma. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa has talked about not being too flustered about new political parties, but Jacob Zuma seems to be causing some confusion that potentially could be detrimental to the number of votes that the ANC receives or doesn't receive come this next election.
Look, obviously it's causing some anxiety because it's an ex-president of the organization who is in effect divorcing the organization. But I must also say that I think that the likely effect on the ANC vote is being grossly exaggerated. Mr. Zuma is not a vote winner. And if you want evidence of the fact that Mr. Zuma is not a vote winner, you can go to his hometown of Nkandla, where every time Mr. Zuma has campaigned for the ANC in Nkandla, the IFP has increased its majority. His faction is not particularly popular with voters. When Mr. Zuma's ally, Mbombela, was the premier of the Northwest Province, the ANC was losing by-election after by-election after by-election. When Mr. Mbombela was replaced by Joe Mokgoro, who was from the other camp, suddenly the ANC started winning by-elections after it. So they aren't particularly popular with voters. And it's not entirely clear at this stage how much of the ANC they've taken with them. And then their third problem is that the pro-Zuma group, if you could put it this way, is quite divided. Some of them are starting their own parties, others of them have gone to the EFF, and still others may gravitate towards the Nkosi party. So even within a group which has not been a great vote winner, you have divisions. And therefore, I think it is a traumatic event for the ANC, given, that he was the leader of the organization. But if we go by the track record of Mr. Zuma and his allies in elections, then it's not a huge setback for the ANC in terms of the amount of votes it's likely to lose.
But there's the aspect of apathy. I mean, we're talking about a fair amount of confusion, and not really knowing whether the ship is coming or going, if you will. Could this be a factor that there are those that will be disgruntled to the point that they will not vote for the ANC, and failure to vote for the ANC is potentially a vote in the pocket of the opposition?
Well, I think, the real problem the ANC's got, I'm not saying that these things are irrelevant. The real problem that the ANC has got is that it's lost the confidence of many grassroots voters who've supported it in the past. And my sense is that those voters are not angry with the ANC because of these kind of political infightings. That they're angry with the ANC because they really feel that politicians spend far too much time worrying about themselves and each other, and far less time worrying about the people who vote for them. I think there's a huge gap in trust at the moment between people in townships and shack settlements on the one hand and the ANC leadership on the other. And if the ANC wants to try to turn this problem around, it's going to have to devote a lot more time to that aspect, to actually getting down to the grassroots and trying to convince people by actions as well as words. It's not enough to simply arrive there and say, we care about you. People want you to actually do something to show that you really do care about them. So that's if I was an ANC strategist, that's where I would be putting my efforts over the next few months before the election, because that's where the real bleeding of votes is coming from.
Well, you've mentioned that magic word, strategy. Now, from what we've observed, so whether it's from the January 8th statement or prior activity, does the ANC have a solid strategy? I mean, this election is a few months away, and the continued feeling, certainly amongst many voters and polls that we've read or witnessed, is that the ANC is going to fall below 50%. Do you see, is it evident that there is a strategy to counter this?
Well, I think, earlier on, it's a very good question, and earlier on you talked about confusion. And I think if you really want to look at a potential confusion problem, it's in the ANC's response to this reality, because the ANC is painfully aware of this reality, and one of the things which doesn't get as much coverage as it should is that there are a lot of internal discussions within the ANC about who they should go into a coalition with, so they're not optimistic about the outcome later this year. But when you look at the actual strategies to deal with it, it's a bit difficult to understand what the strategy is. I mean, you've got some people in the ANC trying to convince voters that, they wouldn't have their basic freedoms if it wasn't for the ANC. And I don't think that's going to work very well, because people presumably know that those freedoms are there because of the Constitution. There are those who believe that somehow, you're going to find a whole lot of people with the right qualifications to run things on behalf of other people. And then you've got the odd person who identifies what I think is the real problem, which is how you reconnect with the people who vote for you. So there isn't on that level, there isn't a coherent strategy of, what the ANC has identified is the problem and how it wants to fix it. And as long as that is the case, then the decline of the ANC will continue because, if you don't have a very clear strategy for winning back the people who are, after all, the heart and soul of the ANC, those grassroots voters I've been talking about, then your prospects of turning around your fortunes are very slim indeed.
There's a statement, Professor, that says a fish is caught when it opens its mouth. Now, yesterday, I think it was, that Fikile Mbalula spoke about the Waterpool at Nkandla, and if I heard him correctly, one of the things he said is that in Parliament they were forced to either mislead parliamentarians or come up with a story of sorts to defend Jacob Zuma. Now, this is an admission of sorts about the ANC at the time. Does it have any implications on how the voters view the ANC?
No, not necessarily. I mean, obviously people who are opposed to the ANC will have a problem with it. And I'll tell you why it's not necessarily. Because one must never forget that over the last 10 or 15 years, the ANC has been deeply factionalized. And when Mr. Mbalula talks about we, he's talking about members of the faction who supported Mr. Zuma, who happened to include himself, incidentally. And the argument of the people who currently support Mr. Ramaphosa and the view which they will presumably be conveying to voters is that what Mbalula was describing in that speech is the problem, which was caused by Zuma and his faction, and what Ramaphosa and his allies represent as a solution to that problem. Whether they will make the argument successfully is another matter. But they don't really lose out when Mbalula says things like that, because it enables them to paint a very clear distinction between the kind of ANC that he's talking about, that Mr. Zuma ran, and which he was a very important part of, and the kind of ANC which Mr. Ramaphosa says he's running. Of course, we're entitled to be skeptical about whether the voters are going to believe it. But the fact that Mbalula said this, in a sense, may strengthen Ramaphosa's position, particularly in the light of the fact that Mr. Zuma is now supporting another party.
President Cyril Ramaphosa said he is not worried, he's not concerned about the formation of these new political parties. And I think in the same breath he mentioned them along a nursery rhyme, if I'm not mistaken. Should the ANC be worried, or is there no worry from the new parties, is the first part of the question. And the second part speaks to one of the accusations leveled against Jacob Zuma, that he's an opportunist. And what about the opposition? So whilst the ANC is going through these various problems, I'd imagine that the opposition are not sitting idly, but they're taking advantage of some of these challenges that the ruling party is having.
Well, the opposition's problem here is that it battles to take advantage of it because we have a huge hole in our politics, and that gets to the core of our problem at the moment. And the huge hole in our politics is that we do not have a party who unhappy voters who supported the ANC in the past feel they can support. So that, when Mr. Ramaphosa says he's not worried about the other parties, he's probably correct for this election, but that's not his problem. What he should be worried about is the hundreds and thousands of ANC voters, perhaps going into millions, who simply stay away from the polls because they feel they can no longer support his party. And the fact that they don't go to other parties does not solve the ANC's problem, because it obviously means that the ANC vote declines a lot. The opposition's problem is that so far it is totally unable to capitalize on this, so that, as I say, ANC voters who are unhappy simply stay at home. They don't vote for anything else. And this, incidentally, is one of the reasons why coalitions in local government in this country are so unstable. Because remember that despite the fact that the ANC in our last local elections dropped to 46% roughly, the next biggest party was the DA with 21%, and after it, the EFF with about 12%. So the gap in the ANC's worst hours so far, the gap between the biggest party and the second biggest party is 2-1. And as long as that's the reality, we have this hole in our politics where we have a governing party that's declining and no opposition party which can step up to the plate and convince voters that it can do a better job. And as long as that's the case, we're going to have limits to what our politics can achieve, I'm afraid.
So let's talk about the January 8th statement and just what's come from it.
Well, there's kind of irony about the January 8th statement, which over the last couple of years, and that is that its importance is obviously declining because, some of us remember the days, right at the beginning of democracy where we used to kind of study every word of the January 8th statement to see what this new governing party was going to do. I think there's an increasing realization that there's now a great deal of limitation on what the governing party can do. There's also a sense, which is not unjustified, that, we hear the same words every year and the actions don't really change. On the other hand, the irony is that, we're all still obsessed with this party. So that everybody agrees that the January 8th statement is not what it used to be and not that important. But everybody is glued to the statement and waiting to see it, and then will inevitably say afterwards, well, it was a disappointment and it doesn't say anything new. And really, I'm trying to make a bigger point here, which is that I think we need to realize that our society is changing, our politics is changing, and that despite the limitations I mentioned earlier, we are no longer in a situation where what the ANC says on January the 8th every year decides what happens in the country over the next year. So obviously we shouldn't ignore the statement, but it really isn't the sort of bellwether of how our country is going to be operating for the next year that it was at the beginning of democracy.
So what were the key takeaways from the January 8th statement, if you will? Are there
well,
any?
My sense is, the key take. Look, having not, the thing isn't out there yet. But I mean, the key takeaways everybody seems to know are likely to be basically a statement saying, "Look, we've done better than you think we've done. We can do better in the future. Our job isn't over, and give us another 5 years." Whether that will actually be enough, I doubt. As I said earlier, I think that what is said in the statement is going to have far less influence on the future of the ANC later this year than what the ANC does concretely on the ground to show many South Africans that it actually can improve their lives. Because unless it does that, then I think people are going to be skeptical of anything the January 8th statement says.
Now, finally, before we let you go, as we look towards the 2024 elections, what is it that will set any one party apart from the next? Is there a front runner outside of obviously this conversation that the ANC is likely to fall below 50%? What can we expect from the other parties, the parties that will be contesting the ANC in this important election?
Well, I think, I don't think we're going to expect anything particularly new from not only the ANC, but the DA, the EFF, the IFP. I mean, these are all familiar parties. We know them. With the possible exception of the IFP, who has grown quite a bit in KZN, it's not only that we know what these parties are about, but their election results tend to don't fluctuate that much either way. What I think is worth watching is, we have a couple of new untried parties. Untried in the sense that they haven't fought by-elections, they haven't appeared in the opinion poll. There's Songeza Zibi's party, Rise in Zanzi. There's Roger Jardine's party, which seems to be gelling into a political party. And obviously there are others of that sort. And I think one question mark we have is who's going to pick up that, are they going to pick up any votes significantly? What I can tell you is that if they have networks on the ground of people who are working for them effectively, then they have a chance of doing that, and otherwise they don't. And the reason I find those parties interesting is because I think there is a gap. I think there are many South Africans who feel that they aren't represented by the existing parties. And the other thing more specifically is if you look at local government results, election results, you see a trend there in which smaller local parties are doing very well. And those smaller local parties are not going to be contesting later this year. So the question is, where is that vote going to go? So I think it's at least interesting to have a look at whether, to some extent at least, some of these newer parties are capable of taking advantage of voter disillusionment and getting themselves into parliament and beginning to become part of the political conversation.
Professor, appreciate your time. Professor Stephen Friedman, political analyst, University of Johannesburg.